Now, several non-Israelite peoples were left in the land after the conquest of Joshua, including the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Their descendants remained in the land. The Israelites were unable to wipe them out completely. Solomon conscripted them for his work crews, and they continue in that role to this very day. 1 Kings 9, 20, and 21. The Bible is a book that is constantly showing economies of extraction being eroded by the emancipatory practice of neighborliness. Let's take our Exodus narrative back several hundred years. We will find a pharaoh having a dream about skinny cows eating fat cows and skinny wheat eating fat wheat. I'm not really sure what that would look like, but I guess it's a dream, so it can look like anything. Pharaoh just happens to have a Hebrew in his prison, and Hebrews are great interpreters of dreams. So Pharaoh calls up Joseph, who tells him that the dream means the land will have 7 years of plentiful harvests and 7 years of famine. Pharaoh then appointed Joseph as essentially his right-hand man, the second most powerful man in the nation. Joseph was to lead the charge over the next 14 years as this dream played out. Joseph and Pharaoh taxed all of Egypt 20% of everything for the 7 years of plentiful harvests. When they built up a store, they waited for everyone else to run out of food, so they had a monopoly on food. Genesis says that people were coming and trading their land and themselves for food. Soon, eventually, Pharaoh had amassed all of the land in Egypt because of Joseph's excellent planning. Eventually, Joseph's own family shows up for food. First, they pay with gold, and ultimately, by the end, they too are selling themselves and their land to Egypt and Pharaoh. In Exodus 1, it simply tells us that Pharaoh treated the Hebrews very harshly. In Exodus 5, we see the working conditions of the Hebrews as they are being overworked as punishment for Moses' request for emancipation. So in this narrative, we already have Pharaoh exploiting Joseph. Joseph interprets the dream and does all the work executing Pharaoh's monopoly, yet his lineage will forever exist as slaves. The exploitation of Israel in Egypt, therefore, first begins with Pharaoh exploiting Joseph's labor. When the Hebrews are finally set free in Exodus and make it to Mount Sinai, God identifies himself primarily as their emancipator. Thus you will tell the house of Jacob and declare to the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I lifted you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That's in Exodus 19, 3-4. At Sinai, Israel and God can still feel the wounds from Egypt. They can still feel the joy of emancipation when they arrive. God invites Israel into conversation with him. As you read the Old Testament, pay close attention to the use of hear and do as it pertains to the law. The Hebrews were constantly hearing and listening to the law. Oftentimes, the Hebrews will do before they hear. Israel accepts God's invitation for covenantal conversation before they even hear the terms. They agree to keep the entirety of the law before God has even given them the law. The only reason I can find for them to do this is that they knew that the law of the God who emancipated them from Pharaoh could not be as bad as Pharaoh's laws. As such, these 10 calls to neighborliness, as Walter Brueggemann calls them, are given to the Hebrews at Sinai in opposition to the law of Pharaoh. You shall have no other gods before Yahweh the Emancipator. You shall not make a graven image, or rather, you shall not commodify holiness or worship. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain, or rather, you may not invoke the name of God for your own ends, which Pharaoh constantly did while they were in Egypt. While the first 3 commandments deal with sort of the handling of God, the last 6 all deal with neighborliness more explicitly. Honor your father and mother. Murder, adultery, stealing, false testimony against your neighbor. Then, last, we get hit with neighbor a whole lot. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his servants, nor his ox, nor his donkey. So quit looking at your neighbor's ass, everybody. Nor anything that belongs to your neighbor. Under Pharaoh, there were no neighbors. Everybody was atomized because the quotas were so hard that by the time they were done meeting the quotas, they basically had to go home and go to sleep. There wasn't time for neighborly interaction. So without neighbors, you can violate any of these commandments. You can murder because who are they to you? Why do they deserve to live? You can commit adultery because you don't really owe your partner anything. Who are they? They're not your neighbor. You can steal because it's survival of the fittest. You can commit wage theft or any theft. You can lie because, who's to say what can really happen or what really did happen. And you can covet and you can accumulate since the life of the other does not matter to you. Nestled between the first 3 commandments and the last 6 is a sort of revolutionary call to stop labor. the Sabbath command. In Pharaoh's economy of extraction, there was no Sabbath. Work never stopped. The quotas could never be met. It was more and more and more. We need more bricks, more bricks, more bricks, like we saw in Exodus 5. The Sabbath serves as a reminder that we are to operate outside of the extraction economy and enter the abundance of the wilderness where the Hebrews have more food and water than they could even consume. As the story progresses, we finally approach the Promised Land after 40 years in the wilderness. Moses here is laying out the law for the kingdom of Israel. Deuteronomy is more than just the 10 commandments that God has given. Here, Moses takes interpretive imagination to imagine what these 10 calls to neighborliness would look like as a comprehensive system of governance. These are not directly from the mouth of God like the 10 commandments are. This is 40 years of Moses listening to those 10 commandments and wondering what it would look like if they were reimagined to govern society as Israel is becoming a nation and not just a roaming band of people within the wilderness. As Moses listened to God's commands as he promised to, we ended up with a much larger legal corpus than the 10 commands we had at Sinai. Moses listened to the commandments long enough for the principles of neighborliness to play out via law. Deuteronomy spells out a much more comprehensive list of commands than what was given at Sinai. Still, they're with similar emancipatory and neighborly intent. For instance, you cannot charge interest to the poor or to other Hebrews. You cannot take someone's belongings as collateral to the point that they would be in any danger. The example Deuteronomy gives is if you take someone's coat as collateral, you have to give it back to them every single night and pick it up again in the morning. This is so you cannot deprive them of the warmth of their coat at night. We can hear the practice of the Sabbath become a much more emancipatory year of release, which cancels all the debt once every 7 years. That eventually gives way to the year of Jubilee, in which all the wealth that has matriculated upwards must be returned. Moses seemed very keen on ensuring that there could not be a permanent lower class in Israel. Even in our own current economy of extraction, David Graeber, the author of a book on the history of debt, ends up coming to the same conclusion, that the only remedy for the current inequality and debt situation in America is a year of Jubilee. These neighborly practices are intentionally designed to relieve tensions brought about by economic pressures within a society because those economic pressures disrupt the neighborhood. Another thing you'll catch in Deuteronomy if you're paying close attention is that actually the 10 Commandments, the words straight from God's mouth, changed as well. Apologies to the Supreme Court justices and Christians that believe the idea of original intent, but Yahweh is presenting a living law, different from the immutable law of the land, developed in community and designed to remove barriers to neighborliness. Here we see that the command for the Sabbath was changed. In Deuteronomy 5.2 patch, Moses updates this law to no longer reference creation as the reason for the Sabbath, but instead it references their captivity in Israel. They are to have a day of emancipation every week because they were once slaves in Egypt who needed emancipation. We've heard that phrase before. Moses also extends Sabbath to foreigners here, showing that the living law that is born from Moses' attention to God's commands is not immutable like the law of the land. So in Exodus, what we see is the story of an extraction economy being disrupted by emancipation through Yahweh. Yahweh gives 10 commands to neighborliness. Moses eventually expands them into a whole legal system that mandates this neighborliness under penalty of prosecution. This system resists forcing anyone into subjugation by enacting radical economic policy designed to always put the other clearly in view. Now that we've gotten a lot of the meat out of that story of the first major economy of exploitation in the Bible, we're going to look at the next time we see neighborliness and extraction in conflict, and that's in the reign of King Solomon. Here we have the son-in-law of Pharaoh, again showing back up, who accumulates wealth and runs an economy of extraction despite being part of a lineage intended to keep the remembrance of the Exodus event alive. So the very person who's supposed to be remembering and keeping alive the remembrance of the oppression that happened under Pharaoh is now family members with Pharaoh. Solomon accumulates wealth through harsh and unfair taxation policies. He accumulates 1,000 wives and concubines. He accumulates massive military strength. He accumulated a near monopoly on wisdom from other cultures. And he used this military strength to enslave people and force them to build God's temple with gold that he extracted through his predatory business and taxation practices. This cheap labor that exists throughout Solomon's reign is the key to his ability to accumulate. This level of accumulation of wealth is not possible without the extraction and thus exploitation. Even the temple that Solomon builds for God is built using a blueprint from a neighboring religion that has a stratified setup. Only the most prominent members of society can access the higher levels of the temple, which is where God sits. God seems to almost reluctantly agree to dwell in this temple. In the opening ceremony of the temple, essentially, there is language here to remind us that God told David he does not need a temple. He is a God who goes to and fro. He basically says, David, I got places to be. I can't live at your temple all the time. That's why we have this mobile system that we've set up so far, and it's working pretty good. But Solomon wants God to live in Jerusalem. He wants God to co-sign on to his kingship, to co-sign on to his rule, and basically make him not only just king, but sort of this God-chosen king. And God says here, fine, I'll do that, but if you or your descendants turn away from me, I will cut off Israel and I will reject this temple. Well, Solomon's accumulation eventually evoked the anger of the Lord. What follows is God following through on that promise. He rips Israel from the hands of the kings, first with Assyria, and then with Babylon, and then the Medo-Persians, and finally into Greece and Rome, which is where the New Testament picks up. The prophets, then, are the neighborly response to Solomon's economy of rampant extraction. Their oracles talk of community and emancipation. Time and time again, God emancipates Israel and relitigates the covenant with them. In Nehemiah 5, Nehemiah finds out that Jews are taxing other Jews to an outrageous degree. Some of them are even having to sell their kids into slavery or sell their fields and possessions to pay the taxes to the Medo-Persian Empire. Nehemiah was a local governor who was supposed to round up all the taxes that had been collected and send them to the capital. The way taxes worked in the 5th and 6th century BCE was mainly that the empire would hire locals to collect a tax, but the locals wouldn't necessarily know the tax, so any extra that the tax collectors could sort of extract from the locals would be theirs to keep. So if you were good at extracting taxes from people, this could be a very lucrative job because you basically got to tell them their tax burden was whatever you wanted it to be, and any that you didn't owe Medo-Persia, you got to keep for yourself. However, the emancipatory narrative of Exodus shows up to disrupt this. Remember when Moses said that Jews can't charge interest to other Jews way back in Deuteronomy? It's to prevent this very kind of behavior. But here, we have a group of Jews who have sold out their covenantal obligation to solidarity in order to profit off the extraction taking place in the empire. Nehemiah makes them pay everything back with interest and return all the stolen property and swear to never collect taxes again. Nehemiah talks about how he doesn't even partake of the governmental allotment in his role as governor. He's not even collecting his salary so that way he doesn't have to take as much taxes from the Jews so that they can keep their material wealth intact. Previous governors, the people in the role of Nehemiah, extracted tons so that they could essentially live like kings. It talks about the feasts that they had and things like that that show that they were living a very extravagant lifestyle. Nehemiah, on the other hand, seems to live simply so that he doesn't have to collect a lot from his neighbor. The emancipatory narrative of Exodus does not allow room for exploitation. Finally, we arrive at the last site of neighborly resistance, the New Testament. Here we find Rome operating an extraction economy. The entire life work of Jesus is living out resonance of the Torah in neighborly resistance to the extraction of Rome. Like Moses and others before Jesus, Jesus allows the commands of the Torah to become reimagined in his present day. In Sermon on the Mount, Jesus repeatedly says, "You have heard such and such, but I tell you something else," referring to the law that was given to the people by Moses. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." Matthew 5:21-22. Here, Jesus is making the law even more radical than before. We cannot even be angry with our neighbors. He then makes a still even more radical call to love our enemies. Jesus says that even the pagans love their friends, but true engagement with the emancipation of Exodus would have us wishing emancipation for our enemies as well. As we all know, eventually Jesus was executed because his message of neighborliness was such a threat to the existence of an extraction economy in Rome. So then, as descendants of this tradition that listens to the covenantal law so it can reimagine it in new and liberating ways, we ought to be doing work in community to imagine ways in which we can codify the radical neighborliness of Scripture in our practices, lives, and within our own communities. I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "If Christianity was illegal, would there be enough evidence to convict you?" What I find here in Scripture is that Christianity is illegal. It always runs into problems with the current empire. The current system of extraction in our world today, which saw billionaires add over $1 trillion to their wealth during a pandemic where the workers that were on the front lines lost just about as much, would not sit idly by and allow itself to be disrupted by a radical, neighborly commitment to solidarity without a fight. Perhaps, if we confess a belief in the radical emancipation of Yahweh, yet find ourselves with little or no resistance from empire, it might be that we are a little too comfortable with the status quo of extraction and not courageous enough to follow Yahweh into an emancipatory wilderness marked by the lack of scarcity without the need to accumulate. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please drop a like and a subscribe down below. It really helps me out. It really helps the video get noticed so other people can see it and maybe they'll like it too. If you didn't like it, you can leave a comment down below letting me know what you disagreed with, what you didn't like. We're always trying to improve things, and we're always trying to have good dialogue around theology so we can listen to other people and talk about kind of how we view the Bible in contradiction with each other sometimes. If you're interested in following more from me or from this project, there are social links down below in the description. There's a Discord, there's a Twitch, and there is a Twitter. So any of those that you want to follow me at, they're all down there. I try to engage with people on all 3 platforms, so if you have any questions, any of those is a great way to get a hold of me. Thanks again, everyone, and have a blessed day.